Jang Jian was born into a wealthy family, but a prophecy changed his fate by saying that the family business would be ruined by his birth. The only solution would be to send him to live a simple life. Since that day, Jian lived with a very skilled monk and began to practice martial arts, determined to break the prophecy. The story begins in a temple consumed by fire. Elders and disciples try to put it out using everything they have access to. They prioritize getting people out of there. At that moment, a master merchant approaches and is paralyzed when he sees the height of the fire. He desperately asks where his son Jian and his wife are. A disciple addresses him as a leader and tries to calm him down, saying that everyone has already been safely removed from the temple. No one was injured. The man breathes a sigh of relief at this news. Suddenly an explosion happens inside the temple, and the men are thrown away. The woods were scattered all over the area. The master merchant saw all his hard work being destroyed. The scene changes to a nearby shelter. A woman tries to calm her son by saying that everything will be fine and his father will take care of everything. This boy is our protagonist, Jang Jian. He looks at his mother with tears in his eyes, while she continues to say that everything will be fine. The next day has arrived, and we can see that there is nothing left of the temple. That merchant receives a skilled monk at home, and they talk about yesterday's incident. This merchant is the father of the protagonist, and his name is Jang Doyan. In front of him, the monk Jumo says that he came here to say something very important. He remembers mentioning earlier that he has a small ability. Jang says that he remembers this conversation. The monk then feels comfortable talking about a prophecy he saw. He says that he has no good news related to the child's fortune. Jang asks if he is talking about his son Jian. The monk confirms that he is. The father asks, worried if something bad will happen to him. Jumo replies that not exactly. Jang then questions if it is something bad related to the family business. Jumo takes a deep breath and the man shouts, asking him to be clearer. The monk says that it is nothing related to Jian's life. The merchant is a little more relieved. The monk goes straight to the point and tells him that the child's poor luck is slipping away. Jang doesn't understand anything and asks what this means. Jumo says in detail that wealth will come in, but it will be like pouring water into a broken jar. The hole in the jar is bigger than the wealth that comes in, so it's natural for fortune to dry up. The merchant is in shock and asks if in this case Jian is the reason for the hole in the jar. He understands that if this is his son, is destined to ruin the family. The monk confirms his assumption. Definitely his son will destroy the family. Jang starts to cry, saying that this child is the thing he has waited for the most in life. Jumo interrupts the merchant's lamentations and says that he has a solution. Hope arises in Jang's eyes. The monk says that if he entrusts the child to a high monk of great virtue and makes him learn to live a simple life, it is possible to at least partially block the hole in the jar. Jang asks if this is true and says that Jian is his precious only son, so he doesn't intend to let the boy become a monk and end the family lineage. Jumo laughs at this answer and says he didn't come here thinking about turning his son into a monk. The goal is just to form his character, and after he turns 18, he won't have any more problems. Jang asks if he's telling the truth. The monk replies yes and then jokes, saying that it is quite ironic for a monk to advise not to become a monk. The merchant also laughs and says that it makes him relieved. Jumo clarifies that he knows a suitable place to entrust the child and can pick him up when the time comes. Jang replies that he is trusting him and thanks him. The monk says that there is no reason to thank him. All this is thanks to his kindness and they will always help him. After the conversation, the two recite some sutras. A few days pass and Jumo returns to the palace. The protagonist is held by disciples and dragged to the carriage, but he refuses to leave. The mother cries desperately, saying that Jian is only 8 years old. It is not fair that he grows away from her. Jang tries to convince his wife that he is the best for his son. Meanwhile, Jian continues to try to free himself from men. Jang explains to his wife that they have nothing to worry about because Master Jiang Mok personally agreed to taking care of the boy. This makes the mother even more worried because Elder Mok does not have a good reputation. His temper is enough to keep everyone away. The monk Jumo is silent, listening to the conversation. Jang asks his wife to hold out only for 10 years. After that, he assures that Jian will return home. At that moment, the protagonist screams for his mother and begs her to help him. This makes the woman's decision even more difficult. He is dragged and holds on to the door of the carriage. The monk admires the strength of the little one. At that moment, Jang tells his son that if he does not do this, his family will be ruined. In addition, they can be fatally punished by the heavens. So he asks his son to understand that the fate of the family is on his shoulders. Hearing this was not comfortable for the child. He just accepted fate and got into the carriage with watery eyes, but he despaired when he started to leave the palace. Meanwhile, the monk thanks the family for their trust. The scene changes to a few hours later. Jian was left on an isolated mountain. He wipes his tears while saying that he feels like an abandoned cat. Even after begging, nothing has changed. He finally understands that he has to accept reality. The boy notices a ladder next to him and sees a man at the top. Jian looks at the man and says that the reality is that he will now have to live with that skinny old monk for the next 10 years. A few minutes later, the two greeted each other and Jian sat while his master took care of the garden. The boy didn't seem happy as he remembered his father's words about his fate being cursed, and that it would ruin the family. Jian feels guilty and tells himself that he doesn't want his family to be harmed. His biggest fear is that some divine punishment will fall on his parents and they will be murdered. Thinking about it, the boy says that he will be content to spend 10 years here with it. Monk mock. He doesn't think it will be as bad as it seems. Meanwhile, the man continues to take care of his plants without paying attention to the child. On the other hand, Jian gets bored and says he needs to do something. He looks around and has an idea. The protagonist quickly grabs a broom and starts collecting the leaves on the ground. The monk mock asks why he is sweeping the leaves when they will accumulate again. Jian replies that he is doing it because he felt like it. The man then replies that it won't work. There's no point in trying to impress because he won't teach martial arts. The protagonist thinks the bald man is crazy and immediately says he doesn't want to learn any of this and isn't even trying to impress. Mock feels that Jian is just playing hard and says that he is typical of a merchant's son. Then he says again that he has no intention of teaching him Shaolin martial arts. This insistence makes the protagonist angry, and he seriously says that he didn't come here to learn martial arts. The answer bothers the man, and he feels that he is being belittled by the brat. The monk mock does not like to deal with people, and thanks to this he spent 30 years living alone on this mountain. He also refused to accept disciples claiming that he was a nuisance and that he did not have enough skill to teach. This lasted for many years, until last week he was summoned by a superior monk. He told Mock that loneliness becomes unbearable when you get old, especially with no one to talk to, so he advised him to consider bringing that boy to live with him. Mock refused the proposal, initially saying that he didn't want to take care of any brats. But the monk said that it was a request and a destiny given by Buddha. It was thanks to these words that he accepted to stay with the protagonist. He received the information that Jian was the son of a famous merchant, so he thought that this responsibility was in his arms because no monk wanted to deal with the boy. At that moment, Mock laughs, asking if the boy expects him to believe that he is not here to learn martial arts. The man then gets serious and questions what he came to do in the mountains. In the end, it doesn't matter what he says because his parents hope he leaves here learning martial arts. After saying that, the monk turns around and says he will teach him some moves to return home. The protagonist gets angry and shouts that he is only here because they said he was cursed and had to spend 10 years with a superior monk. Mock is caught off guard. Jian adds that now he can't go home. The monk obviously doesn't believe it and thinks that they lied to the boy. He assumes that the miserable parents want to establish a connection between Jian and Shaolin, even if it means deceiving his son. At that moment, Mock hears the boy sobbing and asks him to wipe away his tears, then orders Jian to go to the bedroom and change these clothes because the look is bothering him. The protagonist asks what the problem is. Mock replies that the flashy clothes are an obstacle in the mountains. The protagonist says that it was his mother who chose these because they were the simplest. The monk tells him to stop arguing and go change. Minutes later, we see a table with leaves and some grains. Jian has already changed his clothes and asked if this is the food. Mock replies yes. In temples, the rule is to avoid the use of fire. Eating food touched by fire can make the person's temper become violent, and a monk would not be able to maintain discipline if he got angry frequently. The protagonist looks at the food without believing that he will have to eat something raw. On top of that, these clothes are so rough that they bother even standing still. At that moment, Mock says it's time to eat. Jian asks why he gets angry so often if he eats this food every day. The monk replies that he didn't feel angry today and asks where he got it from. The protagonist soon replies that he heard his curses at him. This makes Jian believe that the monk is so hateful that he is giving him this inedible food. Mock is annoyed that his meal is being called inedible. This is the first time anyone has the courage to treat him like this. The man believes that the protagonist is provoking on purpose, but this thought comes out of his head when he sees that the boy's eyes convey innocence. Mock then takes a deep breath, understanding that it is just a curiosity. He explains that there is no need to use fire because the food tastes good even without cooking. In addition, they can save firewood. Jian is still a little skeptical and thinks that the man only does not cook because he is too lazy to go get firewood. He then offers to fetch it and adds that he will only take the wood that is on the ground so as not to hurt anything alive in the temple. Mok can't control his anger after these words and says that just because it's on the ground doesn't mean it's a waste. Over time the wood rots and enriches the soil, so the trees grow strong. Jian is shocked by this information and asks if taking the logs means stealing food from the trees. The monk is surprised by the boy's ease of misinterpreting. The protagonist says he won't go around to get any firewood because his clothes could end up spoiling and he intends to wear it for 10 years. Mok feels that the brat is complaining about the clothes he received. His veins even pop out just thinking about it, but he takes a deep breath and asks Jian to eat. The boy obeys and asks if he can take more. The monk denies, saying that if he eats too much he will be lazy, and laziness is a spiritual sin. Night has come and it seems that the food did not do much good for the boy. He ran into the forest and could not hold back. The noise ends up waking up the monk and he realizes that Jian is putting it all out. Mok deduces that it's a result of never having raw food. A few days later the protagonist lies down totally bewildered. He says that 2 weeks have passed and he can't control his physiological needs after eating that food. Jian wonders if he should look for some fruit on the mountain. Suddenly the monk appears and asks if he has been hiding around. The protagonist is frightened by the sudden appearance. The man notices some bruises on his hand and says that he may end up tearing his clothes while wandering through the mountains carelessly. In addition, his shoes are already starting to wear out. Jian confesses that he left because he was too hungry. Mok replies that he is only hungry because he walks around, but the protagonist believes that it is because the portions are too small. The man disagrees. He says that people can live well by eating anything. Just believe that it is enough. Jian lowers his head and sadly replies that it is difficult to live like this. Mok says that it is more difficult to do good things and avoid sins that bring punishment. Difficulties are part of the path, and he needs to adapt. The protagonist becomes sadder and sadder when he realizes that the man has no intention of helping him. Anyway, he is determined not to go hungry. At that moment the monk turns around and starts to leave. He says he needs to do something and asks the protagonist not to leave here. Jian, he remembers the words spoken by the bald man about standing still so as not to feel hungry and decides that from today on only he goes to sleep all day. The monk looked back when he heard a noise from the boy celebrating and didn't understand anything. The protagonist feels that this is a very smart idea. Later that day the man decided what he had to do and returned home. The scene he found was the boy sleeping all awkwardly between the sheets. Mok screams, asking why he is relaxing like a spoiled child when the sun is shining outside. This scream was enough to make the protagonist wake up scared. He immediately defends himself by saying that it was Mok who told him not to move unnecessarily. That's why he's trying to sleep. The monk takes a deep breath and says that laziness and not walking unnecessarily are two different things. Eating and sleeping all day makes him an animal wasting food. The protagonist didn't like the comparison. Mok turns around annoyed and leaves the place. The boy doesn't understand anything and wonders what he should do. A few minutes later the monk prepares to meditate. The protagonist begins to spy from inside the room and pays attention to every detail. He wonders if Mok is reciting sutras like the other monks, then puts on his shoe and decides to see it for himself. He approaches and asks if Mok doesn't normally ring a wooden bell and reads a book aloud while reciting sutras. The man replies that he has no reason to make too much noise when one is deep in the mountains, so he reads with his eyes and beats the wooden bell with his heart. That's why it's so quiet. Jian is surprised and confesses that he finds it strange when there was no noise. The bald man asks if he thinks that singing loudly for no reason will help achieve enlightenment faster. The protagonist is annoyed by the way he speaks and mentally calls him a stingy man. He believes that the monk avoids making noise because he doesn't want to feel hungry. At that moment Mok asks the boy to stop disturbing his meditation. Jian obeys and returns frustrated to the room. He feels that it doesn't matter what he says because in the end he will always get scolded. Suddenly a light goes on in the boy's head, and he has an idea. The protagonist thinks that if he imitates everything that old man is doing it will be better. Maybe he can get some tips if he observes how he moves little and doesn't get hungry. The next day arrives and the disciples wake up when the sun has not even risen yet. They clean the whole temple and tidy up things. At that moment the monk gets up and in an instant he organizes all the blankets. The protagonist realizes this and is shocked, thinking that it is magic. Mok looks at him and says that if he has woken up early he should not lie down like a lazy person. After that the man comes out and stars in him quickly arranges his sheets. He tries to imitate the man, but it gets a mess, so he just leaves the sheets the way he got and leaves. Jian begins to follow the monk and hides behind the trees so as not to be discovered. At that moment he notices the way Mok climbs the stones and it leaves him open-mouthed. He wonders how the man floats so lightly like that. The technique used by Mok is called Shaolin and the boy is determined to learn even if it means following the monk's footsteps sneakily. At that moment the man begins to meditate. The protagonist is hidden behind one of the trees and repeats the same process. Meanwhile in other temples the monks and disciples also do the same process. They wake up before the sun and begin to meditate. A few hours pass and the day has already dawned. The protagonist is still imitating the monk and he complains about the delay. The boy deduces that the old man comes here every morning just to sleep. At that moment Jian is betrayed by his own stomach that makes a loud noise and gives away his location. Mok says that he should at least be silent if he wants to follow him secretly. Jian replies that there is no way to avoid it because he is hungry. The monk sighs in frustration saying that even meditating in peace is difficult. The protagonist notices a white thing come out of his mouth and goes straight to the monk's nose and asks what it is. Mok calms down telling himself that in the end this brat is just a curious child, just like children are at his age. The man then wonders if he should explain all this to someone who is not even his disciple. The protagonist's innocent eyes end up captivating the guy, and he decides to tell a little because it's not like this technique is secret. Meanwhile Jian stays downstairs waiting for an answer. Mok says that the practice he is doing now is a secret internal energy method called Ijin Jing, and what he saw resembling smoke is called Qi. The protagonist is surprised. Mok adds that Qi energy exists throughout the universe and you can live a healthier life by absorbing it into your body. This information catches Jian's attention, and he deduces that this is why the old man never feels hungry, because he has been secretly absorbing Qi. All along, the monk explains that if you do this daily you will be able to absorb it throughout your body and accumulate. After that it becomes what martial artists call internal energy. The protagonist gets excited hearing this and mentally says that it is much easier to eat air instead of feeling hungry all the time, so he decides that he has to secretly learn how to absorb Qi like the monk does. At that moment Mok gives him the green light to stay by his side while he does the training. But the only thing he asks is that the boy does not interfere. Jian agrees and goes back to the back of the tree. The man looks at him and has doubts if the boy gave up. The guy says to himself that he would definitely teach a Taoist technique if Jian asks something more, but it seems that he is satisfied. The monk then goes back to his training while the protagonist tries to learn how to absorb Qi. A while later the sun starts to get stronger and the monk understands that it is enough for today. He gets up and sees that the protagonist is still there. Mok is surprised to see that Jian has perfectly executed the lotus position. It is a difficult position even for novice monks and they usually cannot stay for half an hour, but the protagonist is like this for 2 hours, which is impressive. He observes how the boy is concentrated. Minutes later they walk towards the house. The protagonist can barely walk and complains that his legs are hurting. He does not accept that an old man is fully intact after doing the same treatment. In addition, it seems that the monk floats instead of walking. The boy wonders scared if this bald man can be a ghost. Suddenly Mok interrupts his thoughts and tells him to walk faster. Jian obeys and continues to admire the way the man walks, without moving his arms and with a lightness in his feet. The protagonist comes to the conclusion that Mok moves like this to avoid getting hungry. They finally get home and start eating. The protagonist thinks that today was a very good day to collect information. Before he hadn't noticed much that the bald man doesn't waste movements in his daily actions. He spends his energy as little as possible, totally different from the employees that Jian remembers seeing in his house. Suddenly Mok scolds him for wasting time thinking instead of eating. The boy immediately turns his attention to the meal. The monk observes confused that today the protagonist has followed him since dawn and repeated all his movements, as if imitating his actions. After eating the two sit together at the monk's study table. Jian feels that the atmosphere has become tense and wonders what the old man is thinking. At this moment Mok says that the book that the boy took is basically about teachings and duties for monks. It is difficult for an 8-year-old child to read alone. Jian agrees that the scripture is too difficult for him. The monk replies that he has no need to make an effort because he is not even a disciple of Buddha, so he has no obligation to learn. Jian replies that he understands. Mok admires the way the boy always answers, clearly and precisely. He thinks he may have to buy something from the brat's age, at least for him to feel more included. Soon the monk shakes his head negatively and wonders why he would do this for this child. After all, at some point he will get tired and give up reading. At that moment Jian gets up and looks for another book on the shelf, still complaining that his legs are numb. At least now he doesn't feel so hungry. Suddenly he hears a noise outside the house and asks what the old man is doing. Mok does his daily exercise and Jian repeats the movements. The guy looks scared, wondering if this brat intends to imitate him all day because he has nothing else to do. Mok decides to make it difficult to see how far he can go. Jian loses his balance a few times because the master's movements are slow, and on the first attempt he falls to the ground. Mok smiles satisfied. He already expected the boy to fail because it is useless if he just copies this training without any base. The man continues the movements while Jian stays on the ground. He says that he must study yijinting before to be able to perform the training properly. The protagonist gets up irritated and questions if the man didn't say that it wasn't good to move unnecessarily to avoid hunger. Mok replies that this training is to keep the body healthy. It helps in the circulation of energy. The protagonist complains about not being able to keep up because he does it too slowly. The monk admires Jian's determination, but remains determined not to teach him Shaolin martial arts. He explains that there is a reason to move slowly. It is to concentrate the mind and observe one's own body. The slower you move, the more clearly you can see what is happening inside your body. Jian asks if it is really possible to see inside your body. Mok replies yes. When you take a step you observe which muscles move. You can see how your arms move and how you breathe. After getting used to it, it is easy to understand even the hair of your body. Jian does not see the importance of knowing this. The monk takes a deep breath and wonders if he will have to draw. Anyway, the man decides to simplify and says that the human body is composed of hundreds of bones, thousands of blood vessels, muscles, and the 8 extraordinary meridians that serve as a source of vital energy. All connect to each other. The protagonist touches his belly and says that this is why he feels so hungry. The man realizes that in the end Jian will always find an excuse to say that he is hungry. He turns his back and says that the boy can eliminate unnecessary movements and focus more energy on the essential parts. At that moment Jian is paralyzed. He remembers that his father always said about getting the greatest effect with the least effort. Things finally make sense in his head and Jian understands that it cannot be a coincidence. He then tells the monk that he will try his hardest, which leaves the man completely surprised, and he says that if the protagonist continues like this, he may even secretly teach him some martial arts moves before sending him away. The scene changes to the main hall of the Shaolin Temple. An elder checks the notebook and says it's strange. There is little food left compared to last year. Another man agrees with him and closes the door to the warehouse. He says he has heard rumors about an increase in the number of pilgrims visiting this summer. Even so, the number of food received was few. Donations from some disciples outside the temple are missing, but he fears that it will not be enough. Everyone seems to be going through difficult circumstances. Expenses have also increased more than usual in other areas. The man adds that it is worrying and probably the next year will be difficult for everyone. The elders comment that they have never experienced anything like this. It is as if wealth is leaking from a broken jar. Winter arrives. Even with the heavy snow, the monk Mok follows his routine. The protagonist wraps himself completely in the blankets while complaining about the cold. He remembers how his house was always well heated, but here the monk denies any access to the fire. Even so, the protagonist preferred not to say anything to the man. The monk was even surprised because he expected Jian to ask to go to the temple, but he didn't say a word. Mok understands that he can't let the situation continue, because the boy could end up passing away from frozen. Since his body is not prepared to withstand this temperature, his reputation would be much worse if he let the son of a famous merchant pass away. Then the monk decides to check if the oven is still working. Meanwhile, the protagonist keeps repeating to himself that he won't be a burden to his mother. A little later the fireplace is turned on and the boy is warmed up. Mok complains silently that the chief monk left a child in his care, even though he knows he hates dealing with people. At that moment he puts the wet towel on Jian's forehead while the boy is sick. Mach says it's very strange. The cough keeps getting worse even with the room hot and the fever hasn't subsided. The monk thinks about whether he should go to the main hall to get some medicine, but people may ask why he didn't take care of the boy properly. The bald man is in doubt about what to do because he has never come across a situation like this before. Meanwhile, Gain continues to get worse and coughs violently. Mach takes off his shirt and asks him to sit down for a while. The boy obeys but looks very dejected. The monk decides to heal him by infusing his internal energy. This is the last resort. Losing internal energy will delay several years of training, but he has no other option. At that moment, the monk touches the protagonist's back and begins to infuse energy. At that moment, a strong light spreads throughout his body, and he feels difficulty entering the boy's body. This happens because Jian has not learned any internal energy technique, so his meridians are not fully open. There is no other option but to force. The protagonist begins to receive the energy. This process is equivalent to 10 years of Ijin Jing training. It's as if he has taken the elixir of life. Suddenly Jian feels a very strong pressure inside his body and screams. Mach believes that it will be more difficult for the protagonist to learn other internal energy techniques later. A few hours pass. The protagonist rests on the bed while being watched by the monk. Fortunately, it was a success, and now the boy will only have to recover. Mach says that at the very least this brat will not get sick for decades. Even if he is seriously injured, he will recover much faster than the others. But the man regrets having lost 10 years of training. He decides to take it as if he had saved a poor soul. Mach checks on the boy and feels a little guilty for having neglected him. In addition to getting sick, the boy became much thinner than expected. When he got here, he looked much healthier. Mach takes a deep breath, thinking he made a lot of mistakes. He always believed that he should keep as much distance as possible from people, but now he is feeling sorry, a feeling that had been excluded from his life many years ago. Your disciple. At this moment, Mach is positioned to begin his meditation and thinks that perhaps understanding the suffering of others will help him to eliminate his own attachments. He may even find the path of wisdom that Buddha spoke of. 3 days later, the snow decreases considerably. Mach asks if Jian has finally woken up. The boy says he feels more refreshed than usual and asks how long he slept. Mach widens his eyes, surprised that the brat doesn't remember anything. He also seems to be unable to notice the changes in his own body. After that, the two will meditate outside. Jian doesn't feel cold even sitting in the snow and thinks that now he will finally be able to fill his lungs with air. The bald man looks at him, believing that this time his training will be easier. After all, his meridians were opened during the complete cleaning of the body. Mach hopes that the boy will take advantage of the opportunity. Anyone would have spent a fortune for it. At that moment, Jian follows the monk's movements, hands on his knees with palms facing up and inhaling slowly through his nose. The boy remains determined. On the other hand, the monk thinks that if he taught martial arts now, this brat could become a very skilled warrior, but he soon tells himself that this thought is useless. To do so, he has to teach as a lay disciple and get the permission of the head monk. In addition, he believes that the protagonist's physique is not suitable for martial arts. These thoughts end up distracting the monk throughout the training. A few days later, the protagonist continues the usual training. Suddenly, he feels a slight tingling in his nose and abdomen when he inhales. The boy realizes that he is finally gathering energy. He smiles, saying that it was worth following the master. At the end of the afternoon, the monk approaches to see how the brat is doing and notices that he seems excited. In addition, the bald man felt a different energy in today's training. This makes him think that the protagonist may have learned the Dantian breathing technique. The monk quickly jumps from the stone in disbelief. He says that there is no way the brat can do this on his own since he never learned. It is probably the energy of his own cultivation that is still circulating in the environment, but as soon as he lands on the ground, this thought disappears. The man feels his body heavy and assumes that it is from the loss of the 10 years of internal energy at once. He passes by the protagonist and says that is enough for today. Jian asks for a few more minutes, but soon realizes that the monk is not in a good mood and obeys. The next day, the snow is almost all gone. Jian celebrates that he can now see through his body. He raises his hand, saying that he can even lightly feel the breeze passing through each strand of hair. The monk feels a strange energy again, but assumes that it is his own. He soon explains to the protagonist that the cultivation of reverse energy improves muscles and bones to suit martial arts. This means that if he learns the martial arts of Shaolin while in a state of reverse energy cultivation, his body will become stronger and his bones will become more resilient, but the monk makes it clear that he doesn't need to put in the effort because so far he hasn't learned any martial arts. Jian agrees and says that he just wants to stay without feeling hungry. He even gives a satisfied smile. Mok is impressed that the boy is dedicating himself every day to the difficult training for not feeling hungry. If it continues like this, it is possible that the energy of reverse cultivation will respond. He does not know what he will do if this happens. A little later, spring arrives and Jian reaps some fruits. He continues training hard between all seasons, firmly determined. 3 years pass. The monk Jumo arrives for a visit at the temple. He wonders how that boy is after these years. The monk is soon greeted by some disciples of the main temple. They both greet each other and Jumo says that he came to see Guang Yun. The men are surprised, thinking that this monk must be very important to be friends with the chief monk. One of them runs and says that he is going to call the master. The other invites Jumo kindly to come in. The monk enters and the first thing he notices is that things look bad. He asks what happened for the place to be so degraded and why no one is repairing these towers. The disciple replies that in fact they have already made several attempts to fix the towers, but nothing went right. Jumo is frightened and asks what he means by this. The disciple confesses that the finances of the Shaolin Temple are in a precarious situation right now. The scene changes to Jumo talking to the chief monk. The man tells that recently the Shaolin Temple has gone through hard times. They are not even able to spend on tea, so they are using a low-quality one. Jumo is surprised because he knows that the head monk has never denied a good tea, even in hard times. He asks if that's why the towers haven't been repaired. The chief monk replies that there's no point in fixing them because they keep crumbling incessantly. In the last 3 years the inner courtyard has been almost abandoned. Suddenly Jumo remembers something and asks if it could be that. He takes a look at the temple and realizes that it's been 3 years since he brought Jian to the Shaolin Temple. The monk wonders if the boy's bad luck could affect this place. It's a bit absurd to think that because this is the renowned Shaolin Temple, in addition the protagonist was not even accepted as a disciple. He just came to the nearby mountain to be taken care of, so it doesn't make sense that the Shaolin Temple is collapsing because of him. Jumo believes that it is only a coincidence and tells the chief monk that as much as it is not normal, he can help with money from his sect. The chief monk kindly thanks him for the generous offer, but explains that fortunately the harvest in Sadap has been abundant every year, so they don't have to worry about food. Jumo is scared to hear this because it is exactly part of the prophecy about the protagonist. Things go well, but there are always more expenses. It is like trying to fill a leaky jar. Jumo starts to back down and the head monk asks if he is already leaving. Jumo replies that he intends to hold 10,000 worships for Shaolin in the temple hall. The man asks scared why he is going so far through the temple. The truth is that Jumo feels guilty for bringing the protagonist here and all this happened, so he doesn't think it's fair to stand by doing nothing. The chief monk reminds the man that he is no longer young enough to make that much effort, then asks why he is acting like this all of a sudden. A little later, Jumo kneels in the temple hall. He says that he will not let Shaolin be ruined, at which point the monk begins to bow to the Buddha statue. Years later, Jumo meets with the chief monk. The man asks him to stop because it can be dangerous. He is no longer young enough to bear 10,000 bows. Jumo only asks if the temple has improved this year, but receives a negative answer. The man then returns to the temple hall. The chief monk recognizes that he cannot stop him. In addition, the Shaolin weather is with the atmosphere better thanks to Jumo. Some young monks have volunteered to offer 1,000 and even 10,000 bows. The chief monk tells himself that he will have a big chevron when all this is over, then turns to his disciples and says that they need to work hard so that Jumo doesn't come next year. The scene changes to the protagonist, who is 15 years old. Mok asks unsatisfied, "What is this?" Jian replies that it is breakfast. The monk looks carefully at the leaves and grains on the table. He finds everything very organized and soon questions what the leaves are. Jian replies that it is amaranth. Mok finally finds a defect and asks why they are cut like this. Jian says it's because he found it more beautiful. In addition, he removed the inedible parts and the ones that the insects ate. That's why this shape. Mok takes a deep breath and confesses that the boy is talented. He even lined up the grains of rice one by one. Then the monk complains that his indigestion lately is because he can't taste the food when it's perfectly prepared. That's the best way to complain and praise at the same time. The protagonist refuted the man's answer by saying that it was he himself who said that the food should be well organized to look natural. The monk doesn't like to have his words used against himself. It seems that this boy is growing smarter and smarter. He then tells the protagonist that it's better to eat because he doesn't feel like arguing with a brat today. Jian gives a satisfied smile and says to enjoy the meal. A little later, the mock monk walks around outside the house for a while and looks up feeling a tense atmosphere. He wonders if it's due to Shaolin's financial problems, but comes to the conclusion that it has nothing to do with it. The man doesn't know what's going on lately, but he keeps having this strange and uncomfortable feeling that he can't identify. Every day this feeling returns and he doesn't know what it can be. Mok sighs and asks what the source of this frustration is. Meanwhile, Jian sneaks through the door and realizes that there is something bothering the bald man. A few minutes later the monk enters the house and finds everything extremely organized. This makes the man angry instead of happy. He looks carefully at every detail and says that this is the reason for his discomfort. That's why he feels so uncomfortable and frustrated. Mok thinks that the protagonist has an obsessive organization. This would prove why he has been acting stranger and stranger lately. In fact, in all the 7 years they lived together, he has never seen him relax. The boy is in fact determined. The scene changes to Mok taking care of his garden, while Jian collects all the leaves on the ground. He notices that the protagonist's movements are lighter and lighter. His shoulders hardly move and he is a little polished. In general there is no wasted movement. This leaves the monk surprised because even if he knew that Jian was trying to imitate his steps, he never thought that the boy would be so equal. In addition, the technique used can only be mastered by those who know how to control their inner energy. Suddenly the monk decides to stop everything he is doing and calls the protagonist. He remembers that in all these years he has not taught any martial art to Jian, but those who see this boy may think that he secretly learned Shaolin techniques. This would put Mok at risk. So he asks how Jian learned to take these steps. The protagonist seems a little surprised by the question, and the next moment gives a smile saying that he finally realized he can now walk like his master. Mok is surprised to realize that Jian was able to learn martial arts just by copying what he did. He refuses to believe that it is true because until a while ago the protagonist was just a child who didn't even know what IQ was. The monk asks a new question about when it started. Jian says that until yesterday he couldn't do it very well, but he tried today and it just worked. He explains that he has been trying since Mok said that to avoid hunger you just don't waste energy on unnecessary things. During these years his head reflected on how he could achieve maximum results with minimum effort. The monk is frightened by this answer and believes that even with effort it should be impossible to learn, so he asks if Jian really thought he moved minimally to avoid hunger. The boy asks surprised if that wasn't it. Mok looks at him with a silly face and then asks for his hand. Jian obeys and wonders what the guy is trying to find out. The monk checks the protagonist's meridians and discovers that he has internal energy. Not only that, it's like the kid has at least 20 years of internal energy. Mok is impressed because he never taught him any breathing techniques and he never had time to secretly train. It doesn't make sense that he has accumulated so much inner energy. He decides to better understand how this happened and asks how Jian has been breathing every morning. The protagonist makes the movement of inhaling and exhaling, then says that if there is one thing he has done is consume a lot of air. Mok is scared to see that the boy is breathing qi. Now it makes sense. For 7 years he has been practicing the Hengong technique. The monk begins to remember that a few years ago he opened his meridians. Probably his consistent practice of Hengong allowed him to accumulate inner strength without knowing it. At that moment the protagonist interrupts the man's thoughts and asks why he is so serious. The monk tries to disguise it by saying that it is nothing and explains that the step he performed is a Shaolin technique called Boyang Shinbo. The monk asks how he managed to imitate so perfectly. Jian replies that he observed that Mok always walked without moving his shoulders. In addition, he steps lightly while looking ahead. The boy shows in practice how it is. Mok watches paralyzed as the protagonist performs Boyang Shinbo's enhanced technique. It's as if the boy had invented a different type of step within the original technique. Initially Boyang Shinbo was prepared as a combat technique, but this boy's steps are not for combat. It seems that he is trying to reach his destination with minimal movement and maximum speed. While Jian is happy to retrace his master's steps, the man worries thinking about what he should do now. A little later the night comes. The protagonist sleeps comfortably, but Mok continues to reflect on what happened today. He believes that there are not many disciples of the second Shaolin generation with body control like this. Moreover, most of those disciples are 20 years old, while Jian is only 15 years old. It seems crazy to think that he has incredible control without learning any martial art. The man blows out the only lit candle to rest, but soon a concern comes to his mind. He fears that Jian will continue to accumulate inner strength and end up using it recklessly. If this happens, he may fall into chi deviation. The monk thinks if it is better to teach him the correct way so as not to have danger in the future, but he knows that to do this depends exclusively on the permission of the chief monk. The man decides that he will solve it later and lies down to sleep. The next day at the Shaolin Temple, the chief monk receives a visit from the supervising monk and says that it is fortunate that donations are returning to normal. Finally, the difficulties are being resolved. The supervising monk named Going says that he is sure that the finances will recover soon. It is only a matter of time. The chief monk says that the last few years have been very stressful. Now everything is going back to normal. At this moment, the monk takes his rosary while saying that everything is thanks to Jumo. Buddha did not ignore his virtuous acts and accepted his bows. Going agrees and asks if the chief monk does not intend to talk to the administrators now that things are improving. The man seems confused by the question. The supervising monk says that it is rare for so many disciples to face financial problems at the same time, but it may end up happening again and they need to be prepared, such as increasing the temple assets to avoid similar situations in the future. The chief monk firmly replies that it's not possible. Many people are starving right now and can pass away if they don't help. The supervisor is a little shocked by his tone of voice. The chief monk adds that they are monks before being members of a martial sect, so the main goal is to help everyone. Going quickly apologizes and says he won't talk nonsense anymore. The monk smiles and says that everything is fine. The scene changes to the protagonist in the middle of the forest eating the fruits he collected. He is happy to have walked so far without feeling hungry. His thoughts go back again to his master, and Jian remembers that the man has been very quiet lately. He complains about trying to guess and says that none of this would be happening if the bald man spoke openly. Suddenly a breeze passes behind him and a voice asks what the boy is eating with such excitement. The protagonist is so scared that his fruits fall to the ground. He stutters, asking who the man is. The monk apologizes for the fright. Meanwhile, the protagonist stays on the ground with his face scared because he did not feel the presence of this man. He notices his clothes and deduces that he is from the Shaolin Temple. Thinking about it, the boy decides to politely greet the man and introduces himself as Jian, then says that he lives with the monk Mok. The guy asks surprised if he lives with Mok. The protagonist questions if he knows him. The man observes the boy's clothes and says that it really makes sense for him to live with Mok. In the next moment, he confesses to Jian that he has seen him several times. This leaves the boy surprised because he doesn't remember the monk. The guy asks if it wasn't him who was eating some mountain fruits a few days ago. He remembers seeing the boy use the Yangjosu technique to get the fruit. Then he used the Kpolyang Shinbo step technique. The monk wonders if Mok taught these movements, but remembers that he does not accept any disciple. Of all this, the most surprising thing is to know how the boy managed to live with someone as strict as Mok for 7 years. The protagonist asks if the man also finds his master strict. He confesses that it was very difficult when he arrived here. In fact, Mok scolds him to this day. The man laughs and says that Mok really is like that, but Jian is confused and asks who he is after all. The monk realizes that he has not introduced himself so far and says that his name is Hong-O. His level is higher than that of the current head monk of the Shaolin Temple. After the introduction, he asks if the protagonist is a disciple of Mok. Jian immediately denies it and says that they only live together. Hong says that this is strange because he is sure he saw him wearing Bolyang Shinbo a short time ago. The protagonist replies that he heard Mok say the same thing, but he doesn't even know what it is. The monk is surprised and asks if he doesn't know it's a martial art. Jian replies that he's never practiced any. Hong says it's strange because he clearly mastered martial arts, then asks to see his hand. The man tries to look at the protagonist's meridians, but it doesn't work very well and he feels a very powerful force blocking his internal energy. Hong tells himself that this is admirable for someone his age. On the other hand, Jian can't stand showing his hand to these bald men anymore. A few minutes later they continue talking. Jian reports that Mok said there was something strange about him and feared that something serious would happen, but he doesn't know what it could be. Hong shakes his head negatively, saying that it could be a calling. It could be yes and it could be not. This answer left the protagonist more confused than at the beginning. He asks what he should do now that there are only 3 years left. Hong asks scared what will happen in 3 years. He asks for the full story and says that maybe he can help him. Jian feels safe and tells him that he has been away from his family for almost 10 years thanks to his bad fate. It all started when he was 8 years old. Half an hour after the protagonist finishes his story, Hong is paralyzed, realizing that this 15-year-old boy learned martial arts only by imitating Mok. He believes that Jian is a truly rare talent. If he learned some simple martial arts techniques, he would definitely be hailed as a rising star. At that moment Hong says that the head monk's vision of handing him over to Mok was really amazing. The protagonist soon asks what he should do now that there are only 3 years left. Hong asks him to calm down because there is nothing worse than living with an evil guy like Mok for 7 years. The monk adds that worry sickens the body and Buddha will not abandon the merit he has accumulated so far. Jian confusedly replies that he has not accumulated any merit. Hong thinks about it and wonders what he should do. He then asks the protagonist not to talk about his visit to the monk Mok. Jian replies that he cannot lie to his master. The monk says it's not a lie and adds that it's just to surprise Mok later. The protagonist believes the man and agrees. Hong then says goodbye saying he needs to go now. The two greet each other and the man leaves. Jian is alone and realizes that this monk walks even faster than Mok. Maybe I could learn to walk like that one day. A little later the scene changes to the Shaolin Temple. The chief monk asks what Hong came here to do. The old man asks if that Mok child is practicing martial arts even if he is not a disciple. The supervisor asks if Hong is sure of it. The chief monk says that Jian has been in Shaolin for 7 years. It would be strange if he didn't know at least a little bit of martial arts. Hong angrily asks if the boss is plotting with Mok pretending that the boy is not a disciple. The monk replies that he has no reason to lie, but Hong disagrees and says that that boy knows the Yangjutsu and Bulyang Shinbo techniques. This information catches the chief monk and the supervisor off guard. The boss asks with fear if Hong is talking about Shaolin's secret techniques. The supervisor says that if this is true it is very dangerous. After all, that boy is not even a disciple. It is against the rules to teach the secret techniques of Shaolin to a child like that. The chief monk takes a deep breath and says that he is sure that Mok would not do that. Then there must be some reason. Hong asks if they think he's lying. The guy says he saw it clearly with his own eyes, so just make Mok kneel down and see if it's true or not. The men are surprised by Hong's violent way. The chief monk calmly replies that he will solve the matter and asks if the guy has anything else to say. Hong laughs and says that the monk is very smart. He then says that he has recently made a breakthrough and needs the Jade Buddha staff. The supervisor is surprised by the man's audacity. The chief monk immediately replies that it is not possible and adds that it is good for him to be aware of the significance of the sacred Shaolin relic. Hong doesn't take the answer very well and gets angry asking if they are saying that his advancement is not worth it. The chief monk stands firm in his decision and asks if the guy intends to go over the will of his predecessors, then reaffirms that he will not change his answer. This makes Hong even angrier. The supervisor seems to guess the reason for so much desperation to acquire the Order of the Jade Fire. Only the head of the generation can use the authority of the Order of the Jade Fire to alter any rules or principles he deems necessary. Hong already has a ban that prevents him from accepting more disciples, so he probably wants to use the decree to lift the ban. The supervisor deduces that the monk wants to steal Mok's child and use him as his disciple. Suddenly Hong starts yelling at the chief monk asking if he is refusing to deliver the Jade Fire order. The chief monk tries to keep calm and remembers how this guy has a difficult personality. From a young age he had a violent tendency and loved to bother others. He received reprimands from his master every day, and even after getting old nothing changed. At that moment the chief monk moves his rosary, while saying that manages to manage up to 2 shurchen a day. The supervisor tries to stop him, but the monk replies that this is not a violation. Hong gets excited and says he will keep his promise. The supervisor looks totally frustrated as the man says goodbye. At the end of the night Jian walks through the forest with Mok. The monk realizes that his step has improved a lot since the last time, but he has no idea how his technique keeps improving without any teaching. Suddenly the monk notices that the protagonist is smiling and asks why he is happy. Jian stops for a moment and replies that he can absorb more chi during these hours of the morning. He says that he has compared it to the chi he absorbs throughout the day, so he is sure that the best is during the night. Mok asks scared if he is saying that he absorbs chi all day. The bald man thought that when Jian disappeared it was because he was picking fruits. The protagonist replies that initially he thought he could only absorb chi if he did the lotus position, however he found that he can also absorb even while folding the blankets or sweeping the yard. Mok asks if he always maintains this breathing technique. Jian asks confused if he can't. The monk knows that practicing this breathing throughout the day is usually so boring that without focus there is no way to store it, so he always thought it was impossible to store chi during daily chores. But this would explain how the protagonist has so much energy internal. The The monk then tells the boy that doing the technique recklessly will not increase his martial arts skills. Jian soon replies that he has not learned any martial arts. Mok asks surprised if he knows that trying to store chi constantly will not produce significant results. The protagonist replies yes. He only does this during the day because he has already gotten used to it. Mok starts to sweat cold, realizing that the protagonist does not understand the danger he is in. If he keeps accumulating internal energy without control and tries to use it in a clumsy way, it can result in a deviation of chi. Meanwhile, Jian looks at him without understanding anything. The next day the two wake up early and go to training. Mok observes Jian and tells himself that he is afraid that someone will find out about it. He has no way to hide this presence for long. Thinking about it, he decides that telling the chief monk is the best choice to protect Jian. The scene changes to Hong's house. He asks one of the men why he is refusing the tea. The white-haired man is the saint of the sword. His name is Ian Gang. He tells Hong that when it comes to a mad monk's tea, one should not just drink it without caution, then asks if it is not Hong who is used to making tea with poisonous herbs. The black-haired boy is a disciple of Gang and his name is Myung. He is shocked by the possibility of taking something poisoned. At that moment Gang drinks some of the tea and Hong is eager to hear what he has to say. Gang says it's good, but didn't know Shaolin had such toxic plants. Hong replies that he secretly cultivates it in his private garden. The root is medicinal, but the leaves are highly toxic, so eating them incorrectly can be fatal. Gang yells, asking if he thought about giving it to his disciple. Hong says he needs to taste it to avoid falling victim to any random poison in the future. Gang replies that he might be right and praises his knowledge of poisons. He even remembers that that guy from the Tang family was furious. The monk replies that his mastery of poison is a level above that idiot from the Tang family. Gang agrees that in his youth there was no one to surpass Hong, but now that guy from the Tang family has become an immortal poison. Myung recognizes this name and is surprised because the immortal poison is one of the 10 best masters of martial arts. It is strange to think that the immortal poison of the Tang clan once stood below Hong in poison domain. Gang says that it is not that shocking and remembers that he has already lost to Hong in the sword technique. Myung asks scared if his master is seriously. Gang says it's true and that Hong is a great genius. His techniques in his youth were untouchable. Even his clan was left behind. Hong yells, asking why the guy is remembering these old stories. Then says that if he can't achieve enlightenment, it will be all his fault. Gang agrees to stop talking. If he admits defeat, Hong reaches the height of stress and asks if he came here just to bring it up again. The gang takes a deep breath and says that for the sake of the Shaolin Temple, it would be good if the man passed on his martial arts. The monk refuses this idea and tells him to take care of his own sect. Gang then asks him to admit that he lost, since his only disciple was Mok and he didn't learn martial arts. Gang adds that it's too late for the man to get another disciple, so he should just give up and confess that he lost the bet. Myung silently observes the discussion and comes to the conclusion that this bet was part of the internal conflict of the two masters. This is because they had many different opinions about martial arts, and to solve the problem they created disciples. So they bet that the result among the students would decide who was right. At that moment Hong says that everything would have been different if Mok was not so stubborn. Anyway, the man is not willing to accept defeat and asks Gang to wait a few more years. Gang feels hope when he hears this and asks if Hong has found any promising students to continue his legacy. The monk just replies for him to wait a few years. The guy starts joking, saying that he hopes to be alive when this child can surprise them. Hong replies with fire in his eyes that he just needs to stay alive for 5 more years. This statement left both the master and his disciple surprised. Gang realizes that this guy is looking to get into trouble again. The scene changes to Mok at his house. He becomes thoughtful after receiving one of the chief monk's disciples at his home. The man asked him to go to the temple and take the child. Mok is worried because this visit means that they already know about the protagonist. At that moment he approaches and tells Jian that they need to go to the main monastery today, so the boy must be the most polite when he meets the chief monk and the elders. Jian doesn't seem to like the idea very much, and the man asks if he doesn't want to go, but the boy replies that he feels he will feel hungry during this journey. The monk doesn't believe that this is the complaint and says he will see if there is any cake left from the fall festival to take. The protagonist can't hide his happiness and says that they must go now, so Mok is shocked by the brat's audacity. A few minutes later they start to descend the mountain towards the main monastery. The protagonist remembers that 7 years ago he thought he wouldn't last long because of exhaustion, but now he manages to descend quietly without feeling hungry or tired. It's a big breakthrough for him. Meanwhile, the monk follows in the footsteps of the boy behind. He watches carefully until he realizes that the protagonist has performed a new technique, the Great Arhat Zen Step. This time the man cannot understand how Jian learned it because it is a technique he has never shown. These thoughts irritate the bald man, and he blames the chief monk for having chosen him to take care of this child. The scene changes to a few minutes later, with the two entering the main monastery. Jian finds everything very beautiful and organized. Mok motions for him to be quiet and says that inside the temple he can't make noise even when walking. The protagonist said he doesn't have to worry, and the man complains that this brat always has an answer on the tip of his tongue. Jian stops talking when he notices someone coming. At that moment, two monks approach and ask the reason for the unexpected visit. Mok asks if he needs any reason to come here and replies that he came to see the chief monk. The men start to sweat cold, and one of them replies that he understood perfectly. The protagonist notices the monk stuttering and realizes that everyone really thinks Mok intimidating. Suddenly he catches his attention and tells the brat to be faster. Jian gets a fright and starts following him. They both arrive at the cafeteria and meet with the chef. Mok is surprised that Gryo is still in charge of the cafeteria. The guy replies that he gets restless if he is not working. As they talk, the protagonist stares at the cafeteria wondering if this is where all the food in the Shaolin Temple is done. Gryo soon notices the boy and asks if the monk has accepted a disciple. Mok asks if the guy can't see this boy's hair. It's obvious that he's not a disciple, just a child who is in his care. The guy gives a smile and greets the protagonist. Jian also responds happily. Mok asks Gryo to take care of the boy and serve some cakes while he goes to talk to the head monk. Jian and Gryo like the idea, so Mok says goodbye to the two and starts to leave. The chef asks the protagonist to wait a while he goes to get him a candy. The boy is obviously happy and thanked. The next moment, the chef comes back with 3 moon cakes. The protagonist looks at that dessert as if he were in heaven. His eyes shine, and he says that it looks much more beautiful than those in his house. Jian even cries with happiness and prepares to eat. At the first bite he feels that he is in paradise, and that he has found true joy. This is the tastiest thing he has eaten in recent years. Suddenly some voices interrupt the boy's moment, and he looks trying to understand what happened. 2 men start fighting about something that ended up burning in the fire. Gryo calls the attention of a man who ended up burning all the ingredients. He says that now they need to hurry to prepare a new meal because it is close to lunch. The man quickly obeys. Meanwhile, Jian approaches the door with his cake and watches surreptitiously. The cooks start to prepare a new meal and divide the task to be faster. The protagonist notices the way they act and says that this looks more like a battlefield. At that moment, Gryo screams, asking why men are so slow if they learn martial arts. Jian hears this and thinks it's strange because he didn't know that martial arts also helps when cooking. The boy observes the chef's movements and thinks that the guy is spending excessive movements uselessly. Moving just the fist would be enough. Suddenly someone yells at the boy to stop blocking the way and take all this out. The boy obeys and carries the basket of apples. Jian sees him complain that he won't be able to peel all this by himself before mealtime, so feeling bored he decides to help him pass the time, but the child refuses, saying that this is his job. Jian says that he is very good at peeling apples, and in addition he will be sorry if he can't finish it on time. The boy asks, surprised, if he really wants to help, and the protagonist smiles. Some time later the two start the work. As we can see, the protagonist lied when he said he was good at peeling apples. The boy tries to teach by saying that it is necessary to peel the skin very thin, otherwise the chief monk will scold him. Jian feels bad for not being able to cut a simple apple. The boy says that the fault may be the wooden knife. The protagonist thinks about it and asks if he can't use a steel knife. The boy replies that the chief monk thinks he's too young to use a metal knife. He sighs tiredly and says that today he will be scolded. At that moment, Jian looks confidently at the apple as if it were his biggest enemy and says he'll solve it. After all, it shouldn't be that difficult. The scene changes to the chief monk saying goodbye to the gang. He notices the disciple Myung and feels that he has the potential to be the new star in the martial world. Mok has a familiar feeling and mentally says that Myung is very similar to Jian, but what is making him doubt is the fact that the Sword Saint comes to the Shaolin Temple. The chief monk explains that he came to visit Hong and probably brought his disciple to pay tribute. Mok says that Hong is not exactly friends with the gang to pay tribute. At that moment, the chief monk notices something strange and asks where is the child who asked him to bring. Mok replies that he left the boy in the cafeteria for a moment and asks if the guy has any serious matter to talk about with him. The monk replies that he was just curious. While they talk, the protagonist continues in his difficult job of peeling an apple. The head monk tells Mok that maybe it's time to take on a disciple. After all, he has been with the boy for 7 years and must have already created a bond. Mok reminds him that he was alone for years and decided not to have any students. The monk asks if he means that he will leave this child aside irresponsibly. Mok is scared by this question and believes that the master already knows that Jian is learning martial arts. Letting someone use skill without having a master is very dangerous and against the rules. He asks how the man knew. The monk replies that it's been 7 years, it's not strange. That the child has learned 1 or 2 techniques. The only problem with all of this is that he's learning the combined techniques. Mok tries to explain that he didn't teach anything, but the master points out that the skills came from him, which means he's responsible. Mok understands and asks if they can accept someone who is from outside the sect. The monk says that he has already contacted Jian's family and received permission. This surprises Mok, because he didn't think that the master would be so far ahead. The monk explains that he did it because the children they have little potential, so it's good to invest in someone with true talent. He says that Mok can choose not to be the boy's master, but if he refuses he will have to be punished for teaching martial arts to a child who is not his disciple. Jian will be punished with the cutting of his meridians. Mok's punishment would be to live in seclusion for the rest of his life. The monk asks if he is really willing to go that far. Mok looks incredulous and thinks that it would not be so devastating for him to live in seclusion, but he could not let the protagonist suffer so much. At that moment the monk offers another option if Mok does not want to accept a disciple. The man asks what it is. The master says that he cannot leave a child out there using the Shaolin martial arts without any direction, so he will ask the senior monk Hong to be responsible for the boy. This is the worst option that Mok could receive, and he shouts that he does not accept this. Meanwhile, Gang and his disciples start walking towards the exit of the temple. The leader says that he had another vision of Shaolin, but in fact it is just another big temple. Even so, his Wasan sect has never surpassed Shaolin even once. Myung is surprised and asks if their sect is not currently the best in the martial world. Gang laughs and explains that when people say the best, they don't include Shaolin. All 8 sects are nothing when compared to Shaolin, so they can't afford that. Myung replies that he doesn't understand how Shaolin can be the best if he currently doesn't have any exceptional talent. Gang says that's why he's worried. The disciple asks him to explain better what he is trying to say. Gang says that Myung has a talent that soon everyone will see and he will be like an incomparable figure. When that day comes he will face Shaolin, so he asks the boy to be attentive to each disciple of this temple. Myung thanks the leader for his words and says that he will never betray his expectations. Gang touches his shoulder and asks him to understand that this is also a wish of the Wasan sect. Soon they will beat Shaolin and sees Hong's face of disappointment. Gang takes a step when he suddenly feels a pressure on his body. He stops immediately and uses his ability to see who owns this aura. Gang soon finds the protagonist cutting the apples. He asks surprised if there is something like this in Shaolin, then turns his back and says he needs to see something. Myung doesn't understand anything and follows his master. At that moment Jian he shows a perfectly peeled apple to the boy, who confesses that he has never seen anything like it. Even the chief monk can't do that. He praises Jian saying that it was amazing. Meanwhile the protagonist tries to do the same with another apple and complains that it is very difficult to make it perfect. The boy encourages him to continue. Jian thinks of a way to peel it in a perfectly round shape. Suddenly someone approaches from behind him and the boy asks who these people are. Gang replies that they are visitors to the temple and asks if he can watch what the boys are doing. Jian keeps peeling his apple and feels uncomfortable with these guys standing watching them. He ends up losing his skin by getting distracted. On the other hand, the men keep staring. Myung doesn't understand until now what his master came here to do. He then activates his ability and can perceive the strong energy exuding from the protagonist. The guy is surprised, wondering who this boy is and why he uses energy to peel the apple. At that moment Myung calls for his master, but the man tells him to watch in silence. Gang realized that his disciple also saw the energy. He turns his attention to Jian and assumes that the boy is around 15 or 16 years old. Even at this age, he already shows a lot of talent for fencing. At that moment, the protagonist finishes another apple and shows it to the little companion. On the other hand, Gang feels bothered by feeling the desire for the sword in Jian. He remembers that the first time he awakened the desire for the sword was in his late teens. This boy seems to be ahead, that's why Shaolin is feared. At that moment, Gang realizes that Jian has too much hair to be a disciple. The protagonist replies that he really is not a disciple. The leader believes that the Shaolin Temple still does not know the value of this boy. There is a possibility that his talent will be ignored. He decides to get closer and asks Jian to give him an apple. The protagonist obeys and the guy starts saying that they should use an apple peeler. Suddenly Gang starts peeling using his hand as if it were a blade. Jian looks impressed. While Myung comes to the conclusion that he and the protagonist are different, the disciple reflects that the boy's movements of cutting the apples are extremely unnatural. Only the fingertips and the wrist that held the wooden knife moved. His body remains without any movement. Myung believes that it can be difficult to fight against this child. At that moment, Jian takes the apple from Gang and realizes that there is no mark on it. He wanted to do the same, but he doesn't remember exactly the man's movements. Thinking about it, the protagonist begins to think that there is something strange. Suddenly one of the monks comes running towards Jian and informs him that the chief monk is waiting for him. The protagonist quickly says goodbye to the men. Before he leaves, the gang leader invites him to visit the Hua sect someday. Jian agrees and says that when he goes he will teach him how to cut apples correctly. After that, the boy runs towards the head monk. Gang tells himself that his real desire was to take this child as his disciple immediately, but it is impossible since he belongs to the Shaolin Temple. The only possibility would be to make him leave on his own.